Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister, Ministers, distinguished ambassadors, dear guest friends. Let me turn to my native Lithuanian. Gerbiamas ministrė pirmininkė.
Prime Minister, diplomats, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged to welcome you here and to express my appreciation that we and Lithuania are marking a very important anniversary of the European project. Today, when commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Rome Treaty, we will talk a lot about the European future, and we will talk not only in this hall, because our conference is broadcast live on the TV channel, Seimas Live on the Culture channel, on the internet. Ladies and gentlemen, 60 years is a very symbolic and significant meaning, uniting our endeavors to create Europe. When looking from the perspective of from the historic perspective of 60 years, it is but a tiny episode in the history of states that count their thousands years of existence. However, the 60 years of a unified and single Europe has become a very significant period. Robert Schuman believed that the soul of Europe will be built, and that Europe, that is, would be built by the same process as each of our national states, by establishing among our nations a new relationship. This relationship has been questioned recently. However, we have made a lot, and I am very happy that 5 years ago the European Union received the Nobel Prize for Peace. In our today's context, it must be said that stunningly a lot has been achieved. Every country is open to the choice of people. We respect human rights and respect people's dignity. And we promote the freedom and human rights across other countries beyond the EU borders. Despite all the challenges, today we are witnesses of the insight of the European integration project, and we now know how right the decision was 60 years ago. Ladies and gentlemen, today we again hear the questions as to the future of Europe, and we debate about the security of Europe. We are looking for new ways how to increase the resilience of Europe. I believe that there is no need to rush into cardinal reforms. On the other hand, the evolution of the European Union need not be feared, because after all, it was because of the evolution of the European Union that we have become members of the European Union. We have become members, and we have become responsible for the success of the Union during Lithuania's presidency of the Council of the EU in 2013. Today, we are going to have a very important and interesting discussion about where the Europe is heading to and what it means to Lithuania. The Seimas Committee on European Affairs has the privilege to lead the discussion and to formulate the provisions of the Seimas on the most important issues related to the Lithuania's membership of the EU. Our reference point is unequivocal. The evolution of the European Union can be efficient only when it is done within the framework of the EU treaties. I believe that the change of time always opens new opportunities. We simply have to know clearly what we want to achieve in this period of change. The European project has been and will be the result of courageous and determined decisions. And finally, there is yet one more important moment. Despite the integration fatigue and the criticism towards the European Union, we cannot forget that many countries that have remained behind the EU borders believe that European Union is a vital project. Therefore, I'd like to stress once again Lithuania's unwavering support to Ukraine, to Georgia, and other pro-European countries in their self-determination. The promise of peace and prosperity enshrined in the Treaty of Rome is very important. With the approaching 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, it is obvious that the European Union still pursues this promise, because there will be no Europe without the European Union, and the history cannot be turned back. And I will finish with the words of Robert Schuman, who said that we would not have achieved anything if we did not believe in our ideas. I wish every success to the conference, and thank you for your attention.
Kviečiu į tribūną ministrą pirmininką.
I'd like to give the floor to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Lithuania, Mr. Skvernelis.
Gerbiamas Seimo vicepirmininkė,
Deputy Speaker of the Seimas, members of the Seimas, ladies and gentlemen, we will soon mark the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, which laid the foundations for the European Union. It will be its 60th anniversary. The signing of the treaty was of some symbolically historical moment. It provided for an opportunity for Europe to create stability, prosperity, economic well-being. Lithuania has been a member of the European Union for the past 13 years and made our country economically stronger, enabled implementation of structural reforms through the help of support of our European partners. Today, Lithuanian business is making use of the single market of 500,000 consumers. We have become an active participant of the European policy and contribute to the implementation of security policy in the Eastern Partnership dimension. We have successfully completed our European presidency, and we have joined the family of European nations. Our GDP rate, the growth of our GDP, as well as the rates of employment have been recently very successful. For us, the EU is not only an economic market, it's also a space and guarantee for democratic securities. That's the foundation of the European Union. Europe is part of Lithuania's identity and development. That is why I would like to stress once again that the government of Lithuania sees no other alternative to the EU. It is our common home, it is our common path towards the future. I appreciate that the support of the Lithuanian citizens for Lithuania's membership of the EU is among the greatest in the EU. However, we must not be indifferent towards skepticism that exists within and beyond the EU. We have to strengthen our security capabilities, focus more on counter-propaganda efforts, as well as the indivisibility of our values. The results of the Dutch elections was also a test to our skepticism. So I congratulate the Dutch residents with the results of the election. It is not coincidental that today we speak not only of the EU but also of Europe's future. The EU contributes to global peace and stability and the goals of sustainable development. We implement a positive policy which is exceptional in the EU in mobilizing the international community towards fighting against radicalism. That is why I encourage all the European neighbors and its partners not to oppose but rather contribute to the stability in the region. I encourage to cease aggression in our region, as well as the further implementation of the nuclear power plants in our neighborhood. Let us not forget the lessons of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, by focusing on the current challenges, the EU continues to be a unique project despite the crisis and the political difficulties that it faces. The EU continues to be a positive instrument in dealing with all these challenges. I believe that we will pursue our unity, avoid fragmentation, and will continue towards implementation of the ideals that have been fostered by the Treaty of Rome. And I believe that our politicians will continue drawing the vision of the European Union. We have to continue decreasing poverty, investing in education. The EU at the moment is at the heart of our lives. It ensures common currency, common market. All of that is not possible to be implemented without the effort of each and every one of us. We have to dedicate our work towards focusing on our values. I wish us all strength and endurance in implementing our goals and facing the challenges in the future. Our aim is a united and successful and as well as thriving European Union. Thank you very much, and I wish you fruitful discussions in today's conference.
Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister, ambassadors, members of the Seimas, guests, and everyone watching us on the Culture channel. Welcome to the year 2017, the definition of the European Union. It is now that 60 years after the Treaty of Rome Treaty, we try to again revive our trust in the project and to draw the lines of the project. And during this conference is divided into two parts. During the first panel, we're going to speak about the testing times, about the future of Europe, about its achievements, about the narrative of the EU, and we will try to look to the future and far beyond it, far beyond what we can embrace. And in the second part, we are going to speak about the things that are close to every European. That is the feeling of security, because we are living in the times of uncertainty. And people started fearing what the future is going to present to them. So therefore, we are going to speak about the resilience and about our capabilities to resist those external threats. In the first panel, we have very interesting people. We have Mr. Petras Auštrevičius, member of the European Parliament, also the deputy chair of the Committee on European Affairs, Puidokas, also the Heather Graby, director of the Open Society European Policy Institute, and the deputy head of cabinet of the President of the European Council, Mr. Andrzej Gillison. But before we start our discussion, we want to be provoked, and the best provocation could be made only by the Foreign Affairs Minister, Linkevičius, who has a very extensive European and transatlantic experience and who will give a tone for our future discussion. Minister, the floor is yours. Prime Minister, members of the Seimas, ladies and gentlemen, I thank Mr. Pranskevičius for a very precise introduction of me. And, well, I am very happy that we have come here to discuss. Well, we know a lot of good words. We know how to remember and to recall all those interesting phrases and quotes. But, well, we have gathered here on the eve of the meeting of our heads in Rome. They're going to speak about the vision, about the ways to develop our future in Europe. They are going to discuss what the future is going to present to Europe. And we celebrate this anniversary in very special circumstances. We register the challenges that are waiting for us and the challenges that we have already faced. The Prime Minister has already mentioned the victory of the Liberal Party in the Netherlands election. And well, we are very happy that populists have not won. It was a very good news after so many challenges that we had experienced previously. Well, but of course, this is not only a victory, this is a positive sign. Well, but of course, there is nothing to be so happy about because we will still face many challenges in the future. But I believe that everyone here in the hall are convinced that membership of the European Union was one of the most important steps that Lithuania had made. We are one of the biggest pro-Europeans in the EU. Therefore, we have to recall what encouraged us to join the European Union, what conditions we have received after joining the EU. We are members of the EU. We are part of the discussion as to the future of Europe. Well, I'd like to quote the first German Chancellor, who said that the unity of Europe was the dream of a few. It became the hope of many, and it is today a necessity for all. These words are still relevant today. Well, I hope that the words that I will say will provoke you, but, well, we have to think very clearly about the leadership and about the content of this very word, and about assuming responsibility. It's not that we have to observe what is going on in the European Union. It's not only about responding to the events, but to dictate our will. Well, of course, there is a leadership crisis in Europe. We see that people are disappointed with politicians, with institutions, including European institutions. They are not happy about the relationship between people and institutions. Therefore, it is necessary to think of whether we truly understand people and whether we truly feel the ties with our people. Many people in Europe, when voting, they are guided by their emotions rather than arguments. It seems that the voters are trying to punish their government for not doing something that they had expected. By congratulating the Netherlands on their symbolic victory, I'd like to remind you of one thing that happened after the referendum in the Netherlands. Because of the previous referendum when the Dutch voted against the ratification of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. It was a very important document. However, it was a symptom that we underestimated the situation that was in place. While declaring that we are for the unity, that we are for the consolidation and for the integration, in practice, we raised obstacles to those countries pursuing European integration. And it showed that European leaders might use their democracy for improper purposes. Well, we have to think that if people vote guided by wrong arguments, we have to ask ourselves why those people are not informed. This is not the case that happened in one country only. We have to think what might happen in other countries too. There is a lack of leadership. There is a vacuum. Therefore, when there is a vacuum, it must be filled with something. Currently, it is being filled with populism. It is a disease. It is something that we should not appreciate. But, well, there will be general elections held in other European countries. We should not remain complacent. We have to talk to our people to explain what European values are, and not only to speak about them, but to protect them too. I'd like to stress that we have to protect our values, not in the fields that we believe are important for Europe, that is within the European Union. Well, look, it was some time ago, it was very popular to speak about single and free Europe. But, well, in our continent, we have warfare, and the arguments of force are being used, and there are attempts to redraw the borders in Europe. There are attempts to justify the illegal acts that have been made. Well, and I don't have in mind only the events in Lugansk. I have the events that took place in 2008 in the South Caucasus, when part of Ossetia and other areas of Georgia have been occupied. Well, therefore, we have to ask ourselves what we have done in order to prevent this, in order to prevent the annexation of Crimea. Well, I know that it was not us who annexed Crimea, but we failed to use the opportunities that we had. We were afraid to assume the responsibility. Maybe we were guided by some other motives. Maybe it is very difficult for Europe to understand that there are too many challenges in Europe, that, well, Europeans have become too complacent. They started observing the situation and tried to look who is going to win. But, well, again, the only capital in Europe and in one of the European capitals, that is in Ukrainian capital, people died for freedom. Therefore, we have to be even more active to help them. This will be a challenge to our values. That will be a litmus test on our values. As far as our security is concerned, security has been the focus on many agendas. Well, we have talked a lot on what will happen after the Brexit, but we have always stressed that in this situation, security affairs, cooperation and non-duplicating of functions are of paramount importance. We have to ensure coordination rather than competition. When speaking about security in Europe, I believe that Lithuania's position is very clear. We do not want the duplication of functions. We want a European Union to contribute to the efforts that are being made within the framework of NATO. Well, I know that in this audience, I see more clarity on the issues related to the U.S. administration. Well, maybe we have to be more concerned about our arguments, about our positions that might be interesting to our strategic allies in the U.S. We have to preserve what has been created decades ago. And it's not only about economy and trade. Well, we see that we have different diverging views towards trade. Many of the things have been created to increase trades between countries. We understand the significance of that, but well, I know that difficult times have come, and we will have to work a lot to preserve the things that we have already achieved. But this is what we will have to do. But in general, there are many things that we can be proud of despite the skepticism. Well, we are very worried and concerned about the emigration. Our people are leaving the country, and it seems that the things that we have fought when we wanted to join the European Union, we wanted our people to go to the European countries in order to study. But I believe that our people will come back. But it's not the words, the slogans that will bring our people back to Lithuania. Our people who love Lithuania are looking for better opportunities abroad. Well, this should not be treated as a pure problem. It is just a feature of the current times, but we have to remind ourselves and to remind them that we care about them, that they belong to our country, and we do not want to divide our people. Well, we have the Union of 500 million of population. I hope that we will not waste the capabilities that we have, and that we will remain a major player globally, not only in the area of economy, but also in the area of security. If we only count money, euros or dollars, but forget the values that are to be protected, the house will not take long to collapse. When talking about the ways for the development of Europe, about the 5 scenarios that have been proposed in the white paper, they are very interesting. We want to get more details about those scenarios, but I believe that doing nothing is not the answer. And the internal market alone is not enough too. What we want is not to be complacent with a 2-speed Europe or multiple-speed Europe. I know that there are countries which do not intend to introduce single currency, but we all have to cooperate in very many areas. We should not compete, and if there is a divide between us, our house will collapse, as I have already said. We should not put pressure on each other, because this will be counter-effective to our efforts. Therefore, we invite all the people to discuss all those scenarios, because the future of the Europe is not something that should be the subject for the elite only. I'm very happy that we are having this event today, that we are open, that we will speak open. I hope that we will be open, and I wish every success to you, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Prime Minister. All the best in your future undertakings. Well, the Minister has given us a whole scale of different event analysis by recalling us the history of freedom of Ukraine, a place where freedom is being defended on a daily basis. and leaving us with a 5-scenario analysis. And so thank you very much for this impetus for discussion. And let's begin our discussion with Andrei. Andrei, you're working with President Tusk.
Very much in the middle of attention for many reasons, but especially he is the host of the upcoming summit in Rome in just 1 week, 25th of March. All roads will lead again to Rome. All of the heads of state will be gathering there, and all the attention of the citizens and civil society will be focused on what they will deliver. So perhaps you could launch our debate by telling us a bit more. What can we expect from the Rome meeting, and should we hold our expectations high or low?
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Before I share with you just a few remarks indeed on how we see the future of the EU and indeed what we intend to do next week in Rome, if I may, I just wanted to share one personal thought. On my way here to Vilnius, I was thinking that obviously the timing of the conference is very relevant, given that 60 years ago, almost to this date, the Treaty of Rome was signed. But it occurred to me that the venue is equally very relevant and symbolical. I'm told that 27 years ago, almost to the date, the act re-establishing the independence of Lithuania was signed here in the Seimas. And you know, I'm a science fiction fan, so I was imagine we could travel back in time 27 years ago here, and we were to speak to the people who at the time were signing the Act of Independence. If we told them that 1 generation later we would be celebrating in Lithuania European integration, that Lithuania was now a member of the EU, that Lithuania was a member of NATO, for sure I guess they would be happy. But I don't think they would be surprised, because that was very much, I guess, the spirit and the dynamic of what was happening in those years with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. That part of Europe which had been kept away by force from European integration could soon reclaim its rightful place in Europe. But if we were then to confess to these people that our celebration is a bit bittersweet, it leaves a bad taste in our mouth. If we were to tell them that 1 generation later, one country is about to start the formal process to leave the EU, that 1 generation later in the Netherlands, a party which wants the Netherlands to leave the EU was second in the vote, and that in France, the opinion polls say that the leading candidate is the one who wants France to leave the European Union. And indeed, next week in Rome, there will only be 27 leaders celebrating the Rome Treaty. And that, I suppose, it would surprise them. Now, why do I say this? I say it because I think it emphasizes how easy it is to forget the achievements of European integration, how easy it is to forget the benefits of being in the EU. And when I speak of benefits, I don't mean things only like free roaming for your mobile phone or passport-free travel in the Schengen area. I mean much deeper things like peace and stability. I mean, don't forget that a quarter of a century ago in Yugoslavia, there was a civil war, which led to the death of 140,000 people. Today, the Western Balkans are much more stable. Slovenia and Croatia are inside the EU. And for sure, there are still problems in the region. There are tensions, there are domestic weaknesses, there are interference from outside countries. But the fact that these countries have the prospect of joining the EU, I think, has played a great role in stabilizing the region. But the fact is that there is a growing disconnect between many people and the leaders, very different perceptions. For instance, for people like me, for sure being inside the EU, which is the biggest trading bloc, means that we can conclude ambitious trade agreements, which are a source of growth and jobs. But for many people, free trade means losing your job. It means that our social and environmental standards are undermined. For people like me, for sure, being able to travel across Europe without a passport is a benefit, but many people now say that no border controls is a security risk. And I very much agree with what the foreign minister was saying on the lack of leadership. I think indeed there might have been a failure of leaders, of elites, who just dismiss these concerns as populism rather than actually engaging in the discussion, because populists for sure don't bring the right answer, but I think they often ask the right questions, and for sure they ask questions which go straight to the heart of people's concerns. When you look at opinion polls across Europe, three things concern citizens: migration, security, economy. So it's very much in that spirit that in September, the 27 leaders met in Bratislava and agreed that what we needed now was not a grand vision, a big jump towards a federation. What was needed was that we actually deliver on those issues which concern citizens. On migration, the leaders acknowledged that in 2015, for sure, we lost control of our external border, but that this should never be allowed to happen again. I think it was a very clear commitment from Bratislava. And indeed, from October 2015 to October 2016, the illegal flows from Turkey to Greece were cut by 95%. On security, again, there was a clear commitment to advance. And in particular on defense, I would point out that in the last 6 months, we've made much more progress than in the past 60 months, whether it's about a stronger commitment to spending on defense, whether it's about operational capacities to conduct missions, whether it's about working more closely with NATO, much has been achieved. On internal security as well. But there, the message from Bratislava was very much, don't put everything on the EU. This is really an area which is much more for the member states. The member states have the tools, but the EU can help. And we have launched a number of measures in order to assist member states in the fight against terrorism. And finally, on the economy, I think there our message was, we should not reinvent the wheel. The situation is far from perfect, but our policies are working. And this year is actually the first year since 2007 that there is economic growth in every single one of the 28 member states. So that was very much the message from Bratislava, which was the beginning of the road to Rome. In Bratislava, the leaders listed a number of very concrete actions which were required to address migration, security, and economy, with a view to delivering on these measures by the time we come to Rome. So next week, Rome will, I think, be three messages. The first, that we should not be shy. We should actually be proud of what we have achieved within the EU. The second, to acknowledge, as I said, that there are a number of new and very daunting challenges. And third, and the most important, a strong commitment to act together to address these challenges. To say that we, the 27 member states, we strongly believe that in order to face these challenges, it's best to be in the EU working together, but also recognizing that on some issues we should act at the level of the EU, on some issues it's for the member states, and even on some issues it's for regions to act. A final word on multi-speed Europe, which has been very much in the public discussion in recent weeks. For sure, the current treaty allows, in certain cases, a group of member states who wish to go further and deepen integration. But to be very clear, it's not about drawing new dividing lines across Europe. Such so-called enhanced cooperations have to be open to any member state who wishes to join, and such enhanced cooperations cannot, in any case, undermine the integrity of the internal market, Schengen area, and the EU in general. And for sure, multi-speed Europe is very much discussed in the press, but for us, again, the main message coming from Rome is really one about leaders' determination to remain united at 27, which is particularly important as we are about to embark on negotiations with the UK. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andre. Indeed, you talked a lot about leadership and about leaders. The necessity of leadership both on the European level and on the national level. Leadership which is often and most importantly in many ways assured by the parliamentary democracy on the ground. So the national parliaments play a major role, as does of course the European Parliament. So here I would like to bring in the discussion Mindaugas Puidokas, who's the Deputy Speaker of Lithuania's European Affairs Committee. Ir ponia Puidokai, kaip jūsų manymu iš nacionalinės perspektyvos,
Mr. Puidokas, what about the national parliamentary perspective with regards towards the European future? What kind of discussions for the EU scenarios are taking place in the Seimas?
Well, I have to admit that an ardent supporter of the European Union, and I am for Europe, but we are living in a very difficult time. We have to say that the Murder armies have been lined just behind our borders, and the forces are difficult to fight. Well, we have to fight not only the actions by Russia, but we have to fight migration and other problems. Well, we can speak about the challenges to the European future and what ways the Europe might take. Well, we can speak about the confederation model and other models too, but I believe that the strength of the European Union is the diversity of its member states. And we are different in culture and in history, and this is what makes the European Union unique and beautiful. And if there is a pressure from Brussels for federalization, we might have very negative processes when populist parties and populist forces will gain even more influence and power. Well, I am not an expert in politics because before becoming a member of the parliament, I was a political scientist. But I have noticed the trends that are on the way, that there are positive signs, and well, these changes are necessary. As Mr. Andrei Gillison mentioned, we have to do even more and to be united, and this unity will be extremely important for us. If there are many more speeds in Europe than we can understand, then it would be very difficult for us to work. We have to remember that there are many things that unite us. We have to preserve the unity, and we should not sacrifice the idea of a united and single Europe. We have to listen to the voice of our population. Most probably you all remember British historian Toynbee, who said that the creative minority has become a dominating majority and does not listen to the voices of the society. Then the crisis happens, and the crisis might pose very negative things. So we have to learn from the past and to look for new ways towards progress. Minister of Foreign Affairs Linkevičius talked about the 5 scenarios, about the white paper on the 5 scenarios. But most probably we won't be able to choose any of the 5 the scenarios. I mean, purely only one scenario from out of the 5. This will have to be a mix of all 5 scenarios. I hope that the colleagues will join us in the discussion so that we could decide what those scenarios might be, so that we could counter threats and want the Europe that we want ourselves and what our people want.
From civil society, Open Society Institute, but you had a very rich career also in the European institutions, also working with enlargement, also helping this country to become the member of the EU. We've talked already about the 5 scenarios have been mentioned by the minister, by Mr. Puidokas, by many other speakers. For all those citizens who are listening also through the transmission, can we more easily explain what are we talking about? And what is meant by all of that, multi-speed, double speed, different speed Europe, and all other proposals that have been proposed by President Juncker?
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all here in Vilnius today. I've been here before at other periods in history at the invitation of Petras Auštrevičius and his team when he was negotiating accession to the European Union, and also with Commissioner Olli Rehn when he was the Enlargement Commissioner here to talk about the Balkans and Turkey and neighborhood policy and so on. So it's very interesting to be here on the eve of the anniversary of the Treaty of Rome. And I was reading the Treaty of Rome again, to try to remind myself of what life was like in 1957, how very different it was, at least in Rome at that time, very different here too in Vilnius. And it's remarkable how very contemporary the language of this treaty is. If you look at the preamble, it talks about we must eliminate the barriers which divide Europe. We must remove existing obstacles and move towards the progressive abolition of restrictions on international trade and on other issues that divide us. They promised to pool their resources to preserve and strengthen peace and liberty, and they called on the other peoples of Europe who shared their ideals to join in their efforts, which was a very bold thing to do just a few months after Soviet tanks had rolled into Budapest to suppress the Hungarian uprising. But this language doesn't seem like that of people so very long ago. People have used that very language only this morning, just in this session. But what was very different in 1957 was the mindset. That there was no question in the minds of the people who signed the Treaty of Rome that elimination of barriers between peoples would bring them closer together around common objectives, that the best way to ensure peace and stability was in fact to remove divisions rather than putting up new borders, was to make sure that countries were aligned along a similar path. These are still very relevant for today, but they're increasingly questioned. They're questioned by populists, politicians in many countries, but they're also questioned in terms of how to do it. It's not just about what to do, but it's also about how to do it. And this is a very tricky moment in history because there is a great deal of fear in European politics. In fact, in a number of member states, the politics of fear are dominating all other issues. It's very difficult to talk about, for example, innovation as a way forward for economic growth. It's very difficult to talk about reaching out to the world as a means of ensuring future security because the mindset of fear is so dominant. And if you talk to psychologists about what does fear create, it creates paralysis, it creates indecision, and it creates withdrawal from the world. It makes people less creative and less curious. And we do see that tendency, unfortunately, in the minds of our politicians too. It's very difficult to be a creative and curious politician at this moment in history when fear is the main issue which is dominating debate about migration, about the future of economic growth, about international trade, and all the other things that other speakers have mentioned this morning. So how do we go back to both the aims of the Treaty of Rome at this point in history and also the mindset of the Treaty of Rome, which was for opening and for overcoming divisions? How do we do that without opening up the questions about the values which have underpinned European integration for all these years, and also the EU's own working methods? One of the remarkable things about contemporary populism in Europe is not just that it contests the values, the ideas of human rights, equality, and equal dignity between people, and also the idea of having a rule of law, which is also institutionalized at EU level. Not only do they challenge those values, they're also challenging the EU's working methods. Because many of the more xenophobic populists in European politics these days are questioning the idea that you can ever trust foreigners. You can ever trust people who are not like you, who don't come from the same background as you, the same country as you, who don't speak your language. But that is actually at the very heart of European integration. If you can't trust people who are not like you, how can you integrate your economy? How can you have common projects? How can you overcome the divisions and the barriers and so on? So populism raises a challenge to European integration well above what it raises even to national politics, because it challenges the very idea of being able to negotiate and do business with foreigners and across borders. And it challenges the idea that you can compromise while maintaining your own interests. And that for that reason, it's extremely important to reiterate that you don't find security in barriers and in withdrawal. You find security in opening up and being friends with your neighbors and doing business with them. And that is one of the reasons why the whole idea of enhanced cooperation and flexibility is actually very challenging. It's one of these things that everybody can sign up to in principle because it sounds like an obviously good idea, but which is actually very hard to do in practice, to do it well, without undermining European integration as it stands. And so it's important to look at what kinds of flexibility could emerge. And the current treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, doesn't actually give us a huge amount of guidance. The provisions on enhanced cooperation are still quite minimalist in terms of the kinds of enhanced cooperation that they talk about. And of course, most remarkably of all, they've never been used. So we're embarking on a new era in the EU without really such a clear roadmap ahead of us. Now, as André Gilson was pointing out, one thing that's very clear is that there will be strong resistance, and I think rightly so, to any form of enhanced cooperation that undermines the single market or the Schengen area. But there are also other principles that I think we should elaborate on in more detail before embarking on flexibility, because there's a serious risk that it could undermine all kinds of things that are really, really valuable benefits of European integration, particularly the rule of law, the role of the institutions and agencies in ensuring a level playing field for all players and also all member states, and particularly that it should not undermine solidarity. And there is a risk that this could happen. And the many different ideas that are out in the public debate are already evident when you think about the many different names there are for this kind of flexibility. Flexibility, enhanced cooperation, as in the treaties, but then you have differentiated integration, which is more of a sort of German concept. Then you have the variable geometry, the mathematical metaphor, which is used more in France. You also have other ideas, like, for example, multi-speed Europe, which implies everybody arrives at the destination, the same destination, but at different speeds. Another slightly different conception. And then you have all kinds of interesting things in the academic literature, like flying geese and how they arrive at the same destination, all safe and sound. But I would suggest to you 5 principles for any kind of flexibility at EU level to avoid the dangers that it opens up. And I've written this up in a recent paper that I would be happy to refer you to, called How to Build a More Flexible EU After Brexit. So the first of these is definitely to protect the integrity of the single market, not only because this is the source of our prosperity and our economic security, but also because it relies on a community of law. And once you start allowing opt-outs from the community of law, you start to lose the integrity of the whole system. And of course, the single market does have provisions to deal with asymmetric shocks and emergency situations, but it's really important to avoid resorting to non-compliance. And that takes me to my second principle, and that's that the EU needs to be a lot more proactive about punishing non-compliance with EU law. In recent years, the Commission has become ever more cautious about launching infringement proceedings against member states that are not complying or not implementing EU law or enforcing EU law properly. Its own institutional role and about political support in the member states. But this becomes a dangerous, vicious circle, because the refusal to apply EU rules or negligence in doing so is the most dangerous form of unilateral self-differentiation by member states. It's vital to strengthen, in fact, control and enforcement mechanisms and ensure that sanctions follow if members don't enforce the rule of law, because otherwise you start to lose the whole system. Just as in any society, you can't enforce the law every day on every citizen. You have to rely on most citizens obeying the law most of the time. But if people see that the law only applies to some and not to others, then why should they continue to apply it? There's some basic sociological principles at work here in any community about ensuring compliance. Thirdly, it's vital to ensure respect for fundamental rights and the functioning of the common institutions. There should not be measures that lower standards, for example, for protecting refugees or minorities, or which prevent EU institutions or agencies from doing their jobs. Even though Article 2 of the treaty is perhaps the least well spelled out part of the EU, and the EU still doesn't have a very elaborate democratic acquis communautaire, it's really vital that the fundamental rights and the functioning of the institutions are protected with any of these measures. Fourth, yes, flexibility on new projects is a good thing, but they need to be constructed to minimize the downsides. And the downsides are the risks of weakening solidarity between members, of encouraging merely transactional relationships between members where, I'm only going to put in when I might be able to get something out of this. I'm only going to do this if you also do this. This doesn't work when it comes to, when you have projects which are aimed at creating a common destiny for Europeans. And there shouldn't be provisions that complicate decision making. The EU is complicated enough as it is. There is no need to add more levels of governance at this point in history, or to create lots more institutions and lots more complicated rules. It's already enough to have to explain to everybody what exactly is the difference between the Council of Europe and the European Council and the Council of Ministers of the European Union. This is enough. Let's not complicate it further. And finally, perhaps most importantly of all, it's really vital that any kinds of flexible common projects bring the public back in. Don't make it more complicated, don't undermine solidarity. But also governments, in creating new common projects, they need to reach out to their own societies for ideas on the future of Europe in their own country, but also they need to organize deliberative forums where it's not just events like this, which are very worthy and very important in reaching out to the public, but where essentially we're being live streamed to the public, they're not being live streamed back into the seimas. There also need to be deliberative forums where citizens can contribute their own ideas, can learn about new projects that governments wish to develop and can give their own opinions. Innovation comes from within societies, after all. And this is vital because ultimately the internal cohesion of the European Union relies on the support of a very broad base of Europeans. And you can only ensure that broad base if Europeans feel as involved as they can be in it. After all, these days, people don't expect to participate in politics only by putting an X in a box once every 4 or 5 years. They expect politics to be a little bit more like what they experience on Amazon or Wikipedia, where they can contribute, they can actually give reviews of books, they can write entries. They want to be fully involved. That's what their daily lives are like online. That's what all of our daily lives are like online. We should have something of a similar experience in politics. And I'll finish just by with the point that we really, at this point in history, have to remember to pool our strengths. Europe's share of world population and world GDP will decline dramatically over the next half century. We will become just much smaller. And the danger is that our mindset will become much smaller too, and we will forget how to pool our strengths in order to meet the major global challenges that we will all face, from climate change to aging populations. So flexibility has to strengthen solidarity because, as Paul-Henri Spaak, who was one of the signatories of the Treaty of Rome as Belgium's foreign minister, he later became Belgium's prime minister, but when he signed the Treaty of Rome in 1957, and later he observed something that remains very true and very important to remember. He said, there are only small states in Europe now. The difference is between the ones who know it and the ones who haven't realized it yet.
Thank you, Heather. Indeed, very wise words of Paul-Henri Spaak. A very deep and comprehensive analysis. I really liked your metaphor of flying geese for the enhanced cooperation. And as we've discussed, the geese are the animals which are, well, the birds really, which are helping each other. Those who are weak and those who are strong, they rotate as they fly, and they make sure that all of them stay in the flock. So what a nice metaphor indeed for European Union and for the European project, to make sure that no one is left behind, and big or small, but everyone is together much stronger and bigger if they stick together and reinforce each other. So last but not least, paskutinis, bet ne paskutinis.
And last but not least, Mr. Petras Auštrevičius, because the European Parliament is always a final say. And we have a privilege indeed to have Mr. Auštrevičius as well as Mr. Ušackas attending our event, the two people who are to be blamed for Lithuania's membership of the EU, the two people who have in-depth experience deriving from our past. So I would like to provoke you with the following question. The European Parliament is well known for its federalistic ideas, for its huge support for the EU. So in your opinion, 60 years after, once we come back once again to celebrate the 120 years anniversary of the Treaty of Rome, what will the European Parliament have to say then? Well, thank you very much for the question. We have a very interesting conference today. Well, you see, the Treaty of Rome has been effective for 36 years only. It was replaced by the Treaty of Maastricht, to be replaced later on by the Treaty of Lisbon. So today we celebrate a very fundamental day, but my point is that things have changed a great deal since the Treaty of Rome. And the Treaty of Rome in itself was not something new to Europe. We have to recall the Treaty of Paris, the Treaty of Brussels as well. Otherwise, we won't be talking of the full picture. Now, why is it important to mention those things? The failed agreement in Brussels in 1948 led to the emergence of the European Union, because some of the big six countries, the founding countries, did not agree on the establishment of a union. So perhaps 60 years on, we will continue to discuss the issues that we still discuss. Perhaps we will find agreements on some of them. Does anyone here recall the 50th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome? Anyone present here? Well, probably not so many of you that remember that celebration. It was perhaps because there were different circumstances at the time, different conditions. We were looking into the blue sky. There were no terrorism threats, no refugee threats. So to expect that we will have no interesting circumstances on the 70th or 80th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome perhaps would be very naive to expect. So what is Europe if we're not looking towards the West or the East? Some people rather optimistically talk of the EU as of Europe covering from Lisbon to Vladivostok. I find it rather too optimistic, though, but we have different types of integration. In the East, we have integration through lies and the five scenarios. Well, I'm not sure which one we will choose. I believe the single market scenario is already being refuted. I believe we will face a Europe of 5.5 scenarios. I will focus a bit more on that later on. But what's important for this audience, as well as for the Europeans to understand, is that we still have some time before December, when the Council of the Council of the European Union will have to come to a decision as to which scenarios we should take. We cannot spend too much time in the stage of discussions. It's rather dangerous not to take any decisions and continue discussing. So we have to focus on serious issues. What I find most important is the way Europe chooses to approach challenges, and I believe then we will be able to choose our scenario. First of all, I believe we have to remain a strong union. Some say a strong union of states, others say a strong union of values. A union of values, in that case, includes fundamental rights, the nations, a fundamental understanding on the basis of which we can build our future. I believe the union of states is already an insufficient thing for Europe. And speaking of the union of nations, I believe is something a bit more important. Now, trade issues, yes, they remain important, but they're not the most important things. And when we speak about the union of projects, we have to recall such a project as Nord Stream, which undermines the idea of the union of projects, because we will always have to deal with the interests of certain countries. We must also build our Europe, knowing that Europe is a union of diversities. We have to, though, come up of a solution mechanism, solution to the issues that might arise due to our diversities, and that mechanism should be aimed at a common interest. If we are capable of establishing such a mechanism, I think things will start moving on in a different way. Of course, I do not underestimate the subsidiarity principle, but common issues must be dealt with through consensus. And one of more proposals of my own to this audience is recognizing and not being afraid of deeper integration. Because if the first goose does not fly in a faster pace, and the ones that are flying in the last place wouldn't try to catch up with the first one, then they wouldn't be able to fly in a flock. So I'm not afraid of integration because this is something that everyone agrees on. It provides a common pace for moving forward for everyone. And what is most important is a wider, deeper regional integration. We're all aware that Europe is very much regional. We have different regional strategies. So let's fill those regional strategies with genuine political and integration mechanisms, which is very important because this enables us to engage our neighbors. The European project is not complete. It's far from its completion. And let's take a look what happens when there's no regional integration. The Balkans, for example, they're basically moving towards the crisis they faced at the end of the 20th century. The different countries, the individual countries are very difficult to be handled now. Now, when it comes to our region, for me personally, there was never too little of Europe in the Baltic region, let's be honest. And if we want to have more Europe, let's build it. The regional relations must be developed, not only at the infrastructural, but also at other levels, let's say the cooperation at the security and defense level, where we can definitely do a lot, and also set an example for others. As for Lithuania, I have a doubt on one aspect. When we try to persuade with a certain position, if we want some change, we cannot imitate them. If we want to see any changes in the treaties, let's do that. Who said that there couldn't have been any amendments to the Treaty of Lisbon? I've given you an example of the evolution of the Treaty of Rome. So who said that the European Union is a complete project? Even the flexibility mechanisms contained in the Lisbon Treaty have not been resorted to the full, but perhaps we can think of other ways how to do that. Who could prohibit us from discussing the possibilities of amending the treaties? Yes, we can amend the treaties if we truly need it, but we have to know what we are doing. And let's act in the areas where we do need genuine actions. Let's take energy and security field. Why do we keep doubting the overlapping of actions with NATO? I believe there are no threats of overlapping European actions with NATO's. It's not anything new. If Europeans need 37,000 armored vehicles, let's have them. When we invest $23,000 on equipping our soldiers, while the Americans invest more than $120,000 for equipping their soldiers, we can see the obvious difference. I believe that once we have the euro, let's be responsible with using it. For me, the governance of the Eurozone at the moment is not sufficient enough. The European Parliament has a good position on it, and let's deal with the issue. We have to be very serious when it comes to money. The litas has been legitimately replaced by the euro, and let's take care of the euro as much as we did with litas. Because once we don't have the euro, I'm not sure what we'll be able to talk about in the future. And finally, change in Europe should also promote the change in Lithuania as well. We keep discussing the social reform in our country. In Rome, a great deal will be focused on the social dimension, and I wouldn't like to see these discussions focusing too much on the expenses, the social expenses. We need other mechanisms in this area as well. We won't address the differences that we have in Europe unless we deal with the issues related to the social field. And finally, yes, leadership is needed, but not only political leadership. We need leadership in society as well. I welcome the latest initiatives in Germany. A young family has declared a new initiative. Every Sunday, the movement has spread all across Germany, so every Sunday people gather on the same hour to discuss relevant matters and political matters as well. So it is really welcoming that people engage in such discussions. And so I invite you this Sunday as well in a march that will take place in Vilnius as well. If we won't organize ourselves into such campaigns, the politicians will not understand how many people in our country, how many there are people in our country willing to live in a united European Union. And so without the ordinary citizens, we won't have a European Union. Thank you.
Va, jau kiek turite kandidatų eisenai.
Well, it seems that we have quite a lot of candidates for the march that will take place in a week's time. Now, we have half an hour for the discussion. But before you think of the questions, I'd like to provoke Mr. Kirkilas, the chair of the Committee on European Affairs of the Seimas. Mr. Chairman, you lead the committee that is a bridge between the European policy and Lithuanians. Lithuanians are very pro-Europeans according to all the surveys. The Eurobarometer says that 78% of Lithuanian population believe that the signing of the Treaty of Rome was a positive thing. 76 people support the idea of the EU. And 70% of the population see the Schengen area and the Eurozone as a positive thing. Now, if the scenario of more enhanced cooperation was chosen, which role would you see for Lithuania? Thank you. I would also like to respond. Many ideas, very nice ideas, have already been expressed. But first and foremost, I believe that the multi-speed Europe will bring some dynamics to changes. I wonder why we fear this multi-speed Europe so much. But I agree that to solve our differences, we need a mechanism. Well, multi-speed, different speeds are okay, but we have to have a mechanism in place so that this multi-speed does not ruin the EU. Well, I wonder why anything similar happens like the things that happened before the Lisbon Treaty. No one tries to unite the efforts of think tanks and wise men because, well, it was a very good thing when discussing the Lisbon Treaty. Well, I talked to Juncker. I even had a smoke with him. But, well, we have to join the efforts of wise men, because sometimes, not always wise men, ideas coincide with those of the politicians. But in any case, I believe that Lithuania's interest is a deeper, enhanced integration. It's not about federalism. Even today, we cannot define what the European Union is, whether it is a confederation or the union that has the features of sub-federation. It does not matter at all. It is the European project. Then the scientists and researchers will soon define what it is about. But I'd like to talk about one thing, about defense. Well, Mr. Linkevičius, you are right. You've never, but well, I agree as far as the military industry is concerned. Well, we need deep integration because it is related with higher technologies. But you've never been a minister for defense. I was a minister of defense. And I remember when after NATO summits, defense ministers would get together and discuss all the issues. But, well, the EU defense policy ended because, well, we started having two different headquarters, one headquarter of the European Union, another headquarter of NATO. Well, a lot of new threats and challenges have arisen. The US now have a new president, but, well, I wish every success to you in the discussions. Thank you, Mr. Kirkilas. Now, I guess we will listen to a few questions from the audience. You have a microphone, so we'll start with the man over there. Laimonas Jakas, head of the protection of the rights of soldiers. I have a very brief question to Mr. Auštrevičius. Since we are talking about the future of Europe, well, we know the reaction of Poland and the re-election of Donald Tusk. What is your opinion about that situation? And another question would go to Ms. Heather Grab. You have mentioned that the EU member states at the EU level have to adopt decisions. When speaking specifically about Lithuania, there are recommendations of the European Court of Justice, according to which soldiers have the same rights to associations. But in Lithuania, this right is restricted. What is your opinion? Because majority of the European Union allow soldiers to be part of the trade union, whereas in Lithuania we are not allowed to do that. Thank you. I am Renata Citaska, a member of the Council of Vilnius Region Municipality. First and foremost, I'd like to express my gratitude for a very interesting discussion today. Today, we've heard of various scenarios. I have a question which I am concerned about that is related to ethnic minorities in Lithuania. Not all the processes are okay in Lithuania. Before joining the EU, we had a very positive picture of the European Union. I can only remind you, and Mr. Auštrevičius remembers that well, in our voting ballots, our voting ballots were in the language of ethnic minorities. Now, this is not the case today. It has been a kind of a regress. So I wonder whether this will be a regress in terms of the rights of ethnic minorities in Lithuania, or whether you will take account of the rights of the ethnic minority in Lithuania. Mr. Vareikis. Well, I have a very global question. We are talking about the 5 scenarios. Well, And one might think that, well, we will plan, we will make a decision, and we will implement those decisions. But this is not the case in life. We have the Islamic world, we have the Russian Federation, we have China, we have the United States of America, and we have very many things. So my question is, why, well, maybe not why, I will only say that we won't be able to plan and to implement the scenarios for Europe if we are not going to plan the global environment. So far, Europe followed the situation, followed the scenario, wait and see. The EU looked what the China will decide, what China will do. But as Mr. Petras Auštrevičius said, well, we are a big organization. We have to form the world ourselves so that it did not prevent us from, did not cynically prevent us from living in a democratic world. Thank you. Let's start with Mr. Petras Auštrevičius because he heard the majority of the questions. Thank you. Donald Tusk was elected by 27-1, which shows that there is a high trust placed on this politician. On Wednesday, Mr. Tusk in the European Parliament made a speech. He received huge support and applause from the audience. Mr. Tusk has commenced his second term of office with a very huge support from the EU member states. But, well, it seems that Poland itself had some different ideas. I know Saryusz Wolski, my colleague, very well. I don't know the decision, the reasons behind his decision. He is also a very competent colleague. But I only welcome the re-election of Donald Tusk. I believe he is the right man to represent the entire European Union, who is well aware of the region problems related to our region. As far as ethnic minority in Lithuania is concerned, well, to tell the truth, I don't even know what to say, because I have always been of the opinion that Lithuania is as strong as it is relations with the ethnic minorities. Well, but ethnic minorities have to be loyal to Lithuanian laws and to the Lithuanian constitution. We have to provide all the possibilities for the ethnic minorities to have their education. As far as I know, in Lithuania, we have succeeded in finding a common language. Well, there is some political competition between us, but nevertheless, I would invite Lithuanians Poles to integrate into various political parties. We need liberal Poles, we need conservative Poles, so that they could influence politics. Well, we compete with the Poles as with a political power, and it sounds paradoxical because it is not the best solution for us and for our country. Therefore, I would invite liberal Poles in Lithuania to join our party. We have some Poles in our party, and we are proud of them, and we work shoulder to shoulder with them. And, well, as far as the role of the EU globally, I believe that Europe must act globally. We have to make use of all the instruments in the common security and defense policy. The European Union is the biggest donor of the development aid. We pay huge sums. We have to achieve progress in the states that we are providing our developing aid. And this is the task for the coming 10 years for the European Union. Madam Heather, the floor is yours.
A lot of questions have been answered, and I'm afraid I can't be the one to answer the question about rights of association for soldiers, because I don't know the issue here, and neither do I know the ECJ case law on this, so apologies. I hope that somebody else has more expertise than me. But on the 5 scenarios, Mr. Vareikis makes a very good point that these are not scenarios among which we decide we're going to follow this scenario and move it forward. Rather, they are illustrative of the very difficult choices that Europe will have to make across the different various areas. Now, I think there are 2 very interesting things about the way in which these scenarios were presented. One is, of course, that they were presented at all, because this is not the kind of paper the Commission has presented in the past. This is what you would call in parliamentary terms a green paper, one setting out many options rather than a white paper setting out a clear direction. And the fact that the Commission chose to do this shows how concerned they are as an institution in the divisions between the member states and not wanting to deepen those divisions by presenting one vision which might be taken up by some members and rejected by others. But I think there is a great value in presenting scenarios because it gives people a chance to think about the future, and particularly it gives them a chance to think about where to focus their efforts. Now, I'm sure many of you at school had the experience of a teacher or a parent saying to you, you're trying to do too many different things. Focus your efforts on the one thing you really want to achieve. Now, it's quite hard to do that when there's a lot going on in the world, when we have the reality TV show from Washington every day to distract us and to make us forget about all the things we have to decide ourselves. We have a great deal of uncertainty about what's going to happen in the world in Asia. Think about all of the reports now coming from China, also from Tillerson's visit to Asia. And we don't know where Russia will move next, frankly. We don't know what is the thinking of Vladimir Putin about all of the regions to our east here. So it's perfectly true that it's very hard to implement any particular plan for Europe if we can't plan the global environment. I agree with that. But what is really key is we decide where we are going to focus our effort in common action. The greatest weakness of the European Union over the past few years, really since the economic crisis began in 2008, has been failure to agree on what is the common solution and to invest in common action in that. We finally got it, slowly, haltingly, with great difficulty in building up new institutions and rules for the Eurozone. We still haven't got there on migration. We're still very, very far from agreeing on collective action and where we're going to invest our resources. But our resources in the past were much bigger than they are now, and they will be much smaller again in the future. We cannot afford to keep fighting inside the European Union about these matters instead of investing in what we will need for the future. So what I would really like to see next Friday in Rome when the leaders gather is a big investment in what is it that we're going to need in terms of infrastructure for this continent. So leaving aside all of the arguments that there are about where exactly decisions should be taken at EU level or at national level, subnational level and so on, what is it that we need to invest in? Because if we decide on that, then it will be much easier to decide exactly in what. But at the moment, our energies are still too dispersed. And finally, on scenarios, this also gives us a way forward in thinking about ethnic minorities and a number of issues. Because one of the scenarios don't include one very big danger for Europe, which is that of societies fragmenting, of fractures within societies because majority rule and xenophobic populism stigmatize and blame particular ethnic minorities for the problems of the whole. And at the moment, what we see is a lot of xenophobic populists pointing one finger at Brussels and saying it's their fault, and another finger at the Roma or the Jews or the Muslims or some other minority and saying, and it's their fault and Brussels is protecting them, or indeed asylum seekers. Now, this is a huge distraction of time and energy. It's directing blame in the wrong direction. It's increasing divisions and tensions within society. And it really doesn't help us to solve the problems in the external environment. So looking at the reality of the world as it's changing and thinking about the big picture can also help us to move away from that kind of politics.
Many thanks, Heather. Mindaugai.
Iš tiesų, nuo pat Lietuvos didžiosios
From the times of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, we have welcomed people of many nationalities in Lithuania. Well, as Mr. Petras Auštrevičius mentioned, we see Poles or some ethnic minorities as our political competitors, but it seems to me that we escalate the problems too heavily. I was once visiting the region of Šalčininkai, the area with the biggest ethnic minority in Lithuania. I saw that it is of crucial importance to establish a close relationship with the people living in that region for the benefit and welfare of our future generations. Because if we join our efforts, we are able to achieve a lot. Well, I know that the question was not addressed to me, but as far as the re-election of Donald Tusk is concerned, I'd like to note that, well, I'm not satisfied that the ruling coalition in Poland did not support its national. It seems that the country itself was rather disappointed with something, therefore did not support its candidate. Well, you all remember the Brexit referendum. I was one of the political scientists who believed that the referendum will not lead to the UK withdrawing from the EU. Therefore, we have to treat all the problems seriously. It is bad when we do not listen to each other. But in order to avoid this chain reaction, in order to not to open this Pandora's box, we have to ensure that we listen to each other and work accordingly. As far as those 5 scenarios are concerned, I believe that they need further elaboration in order to define the destiny of people. Geopolitical factor is very important for the development of the European Union. Therefore, we have to take account of the external factors. I was among the people who tried to find the role for the European Union as a global actor, because previously its role was rather dispersed and chaotic. But the EU is the stronghold of democracy. Therefore, it has to promote and defend its values, not by very declarative slogans, but rather by actions. We should not remain passive, because we won't be able to achieve anything. And also, we have to apply equal criteria for assessment of other countries. Well, Lithuania's economy is not the strongest in the EU, but we comply with the fiscal discipline and we try to do everything to meet the EU requirements. But well, we know the situation in Greece, and it seems that this country is clearly does not comply with the EU legislation. And I believe that there is a need for a clear reaction to the actions of such states, because if we do not respond properly, other countries in the European Union might question whether they should follow the rules of the EU. And this, the enforcement of rules are very important indeed.
I assume you don't want me to answer the question about President Tusk.
That has been answered.
Thank you. No, maybe just one word on the white paper, which was mentioned by several. It's a commission paper. It's a thought-provoking paper. As was said, it's not a blueprint, as the previous commission had produced. And indeed, it needs to be more specified. I understand that the commission, on that basis, will produce further papers on defense, on euro, on social policy. So of course, don't expect from Rome next week an answer to the white paper. This will come later maybe. And indeed, the main message is the one I explained about unity and maybe possible different speeds. I just wanted to say just one more thing on so-called multi-speed Europe, because I very much liked the image about the geese. So I thought I should recall what Tusk said last week about multi-speed Europe. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Poidokas just told me that his thesis was on the geese flying in different directions and in the same direction. So we could now use this for the current debate and for finding the scenario for Europe in the future. Thank you so much. We are, well, okay. Very quickly then, because we are running out of the time. So very quick questions and we'll have very sharp answers. And if you could introduce yourself, you galite pristatyti.
Good morning, thank you for the invitation. I am Audra Sepavičienė from the International Immigration Organization, Lithuania's branch. Migration is one of the current challenges in the EU. It has been mentioned today that the EU has lost its ability to contain migration flows. I could only add to that by saying that the sharing of solidarity at times was not functioning properly from both sides. So how are these issues incorporated into the 5 scenarios? Or perhaps, on the contrary, there are some other scenarios for dealing these issues. So what direction of addressing these matters is envisaged? Renata Kulio from the United Nations Refugee Agency. My question is the following. In December 2016, we've presented our own vision as to what the EU could do in addressing the refugee crisis, because 2015 has demonstrated that the EU was not ready to contain the crisis. So the vision contains a scenario whereby the refugees are protected by the EU. There's also a scenario for the EU being ready for reacting and responding to the possible refugee crisis. There's also one where the EU ensures an effective asylum system and an EU which integrates the refugees in its society. So what could you say with regards to these visions? And we also have another question from the representative of the youth. Linas Mackevičius, a student of the Vilnius University Law Faculty. We have to state that next to the Treaty of Rome, there's also the treaty establishing the Euratom. So my question to the panelists is, what kind of prospects do you see with regards to this treaty? Thank you very much. So could we briefly respond to these questions to end our discussion? Let's start with Andrei and moving then rightwards.
Maybe just on migration, if I may. For me, the issue of migration is not one for the future. It's not, for me, part of the white paper discussion. It's for now. In 2015, well, over 18 months, about 2 million people came to the EU illegally. In October 2015, in just 4 weeks, 215,000 people came from Turkey to Greece, with all the consequences it has had on society, on the cohesion of the European Union, and other matters. So we can't afford to wait for the future, we have to act now. That's exactly why the leaders took, over the past months, a number of decisions, sometimes painful decisions, such as closing the borders along the Western Balkans routes, concluding a deal with Turkey, and so far it has worked. As I mentioned, 1 year later, the flows from Turkey to Greece were cut by 95%. Now most of the flows come from Libya to Italy. A very different situation, a very different type of people crossing. Libya is obviously not a partner the way Turkey can be. And obviously there's no land border, it's a sea. And that's exactly why the leaders, a month ago, meeting in Malta, decided to focus now the priority on regaining control over that migratory route. using a number of levers which we hope would avoid an explosion of flows when the weather improves. Now, of course, there are a number of issues out there, and I think it was referred to when you spoke of solidarity, and in particular, the issue of our asylum policy and the issue of the possible redistribution or relocation of refugees who come to the south of Europe. It has been a divisive discussion in the EU for a number of reasons, but there again, it's about the future. It's about the future asylum system. It's about the future crisis. So I think the approach taken by the European Council, at least by its president, was let's first focus on regaining control over our external border. It's the immediate priority. Also in response to populism, to come back to what we were saying earlier. By doing so, we try to regain a consensus within the European Council, which was perhaps a bit lost in 2015. And now, actually under the work of the Council presidency, i.e. the Maltese, they're now trying to broaden this consensus to other issues, in particular on the issue of the future asylum policy.
Petrai.
Labai trumpai. Europa po šiai dienai skaldo.
Well, Europe is at the moment divided by, first of all, the policy on saving policy, and secondly, by migration policy. These two matters have always been and will continue to be very sensitive aspects. There will always be countries who won't agree to go with the European flow. At the moment, we have been looking into the review of the Dublin Convention, and we have noted that there have been things that we failed to do in a timely way. However, it is important to note that without developing new mechanisms and rather making use of the existing instruments, the EU, by working closely with the UN Refugee Agency and other stakeholder institutions, must continue working with those countries that deal with the major incoming refugee flows. We have some very good examples, say Afghanistan. We have a very good cooperation with this country, but perhaps it will be no secret that next Saturday we might have only Africa mentioned as the only continent for future cooperation with regards to potential migration flows in the future. As for Euratom, I believe the European Union member states pursue a unanimous policy with regards to climate issues. So thank you. Heather.
View of the time. So the first one is that on migration and asylum, we're still in crisis mode of short-term decision-making, and we have to get out of that. It's really vital to make progress in thinking about the longer term. So in addition to the issue of a longer-term policy on which there is a consensus in the whole EU on asylum, which I agree is really necessary. Europe has obligations, moral obligations, to protect asylum seekers. Many of our countries have had refugees not only coming to us, but we have been exporters of refugees at some point in our history. This remains a very fundamental humanitarian need. But we also need to have a clear system for distribution of the burden, which ensures that those who take their share of the burden, and I think Lithuania would definitely fall in that category, are equally treated. So there needs to be more of a discussion about what's the longer term system going to look like. But we also need to look at legal routes for labour migration. We've got ageing populations in this country. Very few member states are producing enough young people to look after all of us in our old age, to be the workers of the future, to provide the money for our pensions and our care in old age. This is going to be a huge social crisis in nearly every country in Europe. I think it's only Sweden and France that still have replacement rates of births. So that's going to be vital. But in order to prevent a social crisis and a lot more xenophobia Serbia because of irregular and unclear migration criteria, it's vital to have a longer-term policy for legal routes for labour migration. Let's make it regulated and legal and aligned with the needs of our economies. That's on migration, but keep that separate from asylum, which is a humanitarian need based on the people who need protection. And that's not the same criteria. So I think there's a real risk that when we muddle up these two things and say we can only accept, as some politicians have done in Europe, we can only accept the number of asylum seekers that our economy can handle. These are two different things. And the numbers who get asylum in Europe are still really quite small. And it's really important to keep working with the UN agency, for example, the UNHCR, to ensure that those who are getting protection are the ones who need it the most, rather than those who are able to afford to pay smugglers, which means paying a lot more attention to what's happening in the country of origin. This isn't just about reducing flows and reducing numbers, it's about having a sustainable system that's in accordance with our values and with our economic needs. So both of those sides of it is necessary, and to avoid conflating asylum and migration.
Thank you so much, Mindaugai.
Kalbant apie pabėgėlius ir bendrai nelegalios migracijos į Europos srautus, tai yra keletas tokių.
Speaking about the asylum and migration policies, I believe there are several remits. First of all, the EU has already undertaken positive actions such as monitoring missions, including Triton and Sophia missions. However, all the efforts must be pulled for the purpose of ensuring that the entire area, the Aegean Sea area, is covered. And so far, not everything has been done to this end. Secondly, the conflicts. We have to make sure that such countries as Libya or Yemen, those that are suffering from wars, including Syria as well, are stabilized. Otherwise, we won't be able to simply build a steel wall to prevent the inflow of these refugees fleeing these war zones. As for the long-term perspective, I agree with Heather in that we must first of all understand that in order to ensure success with regards to refugees, we must be able to integrate migrants as well as have the willingness to integrate on their side. There are countries which have a huge Muslim majority. Those countries must also have a policy for the support for the moderate Islam. Otherwise, the extreme Islam might thrive in those countries. The people there would be integrated into terroristic networks. Society would be alienated and fragmented, and we won't be able to address all the issues ultimately. Thank you very much for taking part in the discussion, and I would like to now invite Mr. Juozas Bernatonis, Chair of the Seimas Committee on Foreign Affairs, to summarize our discussion.
Keynote speakers, colleagues, I have a huge responsibility and a difficult task to sum up this very important and insightful discussion. The issues that we are covering today in the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania will be debated by leaders of the European Union on the 25th of March in Rome. Well, in fact, the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania is the right place for this debate because the huge number of the events that are taking place in our institution shows that our parliament is open to people, open to new ideas and approaches in order to formulate strategic decisions that determine the future of our state and Europe in general. Such debate with our society by engaging national parliaments should become part and parcel of the preparation of the new vision for the EU. It is obvious that tomorrow the morning discussions on the 5 scenarios provided by the European Commission should be assessed as the impulse that promotes us to speak further. This vision will be a viable organism that will flexibly respond to various geopolitical, political, economic, social, and cultural changes within the European Union, in the neighborhood of the EU, and across the world. Well, to my opinion, when looking at various scenarios for the European Union, we should not lose our ability to listen. We have to listen and to hear what more than 500 million Europeans have to say to us. And the reasons behind the majority of the crisis of the European project are the fact that our population does not feel that its interests are represented and its desires are heard. So what people are really concerned about? The data of the Eurobarometer 2016 shows that 45% of population are mostly concerned about immigration. 32% of respondents are concerned about terrorism. 20% of the respondents were concerned about the economic situation, and 16% of people were concerned about the unemployment. So therefore, whenever decisions are adopted in Brussels, we have to ensure that they are efficient, that they respond to the needs and expectations of our population. The European Union should not only respond to the scenarios created, but also should be able to formulate scenarios itself and to implement those scenarios. The scenario of a strong Europe globally will not be implemented successfully if we fail to ensure internal strength, solidarity, and the ability to speak in one voice. The decision of in the European Union take long to adopt. We have the culture of compromise, and solidarity among the countries has long been one of the key principles of the EU functioning. Therefore, we have to be more active. The European Union must be underpinned by the principle of solidarity and to be proactive and to responsive. In the context of the Brexit negotiations, the European Union must preserve unity, solidarity, and mutual trust. Coming back to the internal dimension of the European project, I would like to refer to the opinion of the European Union, according to which 2/3 of the population are concerned about the instability in the European Union. Mr. Pranskevičius has already said that a lot of people are positive towards, a lot of people in Lithuania are positive about the European project. I am not supporter of Europe as a confederation because I believe that this might lead to further divisions among states and might lead to the reduction of unity among our states. We have been united on our long strategic goal. We have to work together so that the European project that marks its 60th anniversary, that has gained maturity, is long-lived. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bernatonis. Now we are having a coffee break and we will meet back at 12 sharp.